Alrighty, welcome back. It's Tuesday. It's another API review. We have 5 issues, so we'll see how fast we get to them. Let's start with this one here. Eric, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So system.json has ships one public converter called the JSON string enum converter, which implements the JSON converter factory class, which derives from the JSON converter factory class. It's a very frequently used code, especially for users that want to be able to serialize enums as strings. However, the issue with that, as well as with any other, most JSON converter factory implementations, is that it uses type.makeGenericType under wraps, and as such, it makes it prohibitive to use in native AOT scenario. So basically, this API proposal comes as part of an effort to basically make the source generator intercept types or members in general annotated with, JSON converter type of JSON string enum converter, so that it intercepts these annotations and replaces them with some sort of AOT friendly call that produces the right JSON converter for the specific type. So what I'm proposing here is a new method to the JSON metadata services on top of the default getEnum converter called getStringEnumConverter that accepts two parameters: the converter provided by the user and JSON serializer options.
So I'm not sure I
There is
completely
a potential alternative design that I don't necessarily endorse, but might be worth discussing if you scroll down a bit. That particular method could be added as an instance method to the JSON string enum converter directly, so that users, if they ever need to, could produce the relevant type converter instance themselves if they wish to do that. I can't, however, think of any good use case for that. So I instead propose that at this stage, we just put it under JSON metadata services where all the other converter factories live at the moment. Yeah, so that's basically it.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand. So why does this existing method not suffice?
No, so I'm saying that we could, instead of that method, publish it as an instance method on the converter factory itself.
No, sorry, I'm asking a different question. I'm not asking the alternative design difference. I'm asking like, why do we need this method in the first place? And you're saying the other one relies on make generic type, but I don't understand why that is, I guess.
So the issue with JSON converter factory in general is that it's basically an instance of the untyped JSON converter class. It accepts a system.type parameter and it produces a typed JSON converter instance given that system.type, which means that you cannot actually do that without doing some form of AOT unfriendly reflection, namely type.makeGenericType.
Oh, okay, I get it now. So we have it. This is an existing type that is non-generic.
Yeah, it might be helpful if you look at the API shape of JSON converter factory.
JSON.
I can share that.
Yeah, I think I just had it here as well. Hold on. And that's probably not the right one here, but like we want this one here, right? Right?
Yep. So there's this create converter method that accepts a system.type and produces a JSON converter. Now, the problem is that the resultant JSON converter that the factory produces must be a generic JSON converter of T, and therein lies the problem. It's a pattern that unless you have a fixed finite number of specializations that you support, this cannot really be made to work in native AOT.
So, Eric, if the JSON string enum converter already has a public create converter that takes the type, why do you think adding the generic overload is a good answer?
Because in the case of the generic overload, the source generator will generate code that calls that generic method with whatever enum type specified in the angle brackets, and that will make the AOT compiler generate a specialization for that JSON converter of T type.
Right, but you said you don't like the alternative. You think that the main proposal is better than the alternative, but to me, the alternative is like we already have a public method, and now we're making the stronger typed method right next to it. So that feels better to me. I'm curious what your opposition is.
No opposition, but it's basically just, it seems to fit better with all the other converter factories that we have at the moment. JSON metadata services is just a static class that contains all sorts of factories of this kind. So the only real use case for that method is the source generator anyways, so it seemed like a better fit to me for it to be in JSON metadata services rather than on the converter itself.
Well, I guess what's the reason for the existing public create converter on the enum or string enum converter type? Was that not also just for source gen? But an earlier wave?
No. That's the override of JSON converter factory. So it's overriding the abstract create converter from the JSON converter factory base.
Oh, so you're just missing metadata here. That it's not a method that you've uniquely provided. It's a
correct. Yeah.
It's a virtual extension. Yeah. Okay. In that case, I think I agree that the alternative design is a little weird because it has some asymmetry. So
basically this method here is abstract, and then this method here would just be a kind of like what?
Yeah.
It abstract in its base class, so it's override at this level.
Yeah, I should have put the override keyword in there. Sorry for that.
Oh,
so the existing one is part of a virtual hierarchy, and then it would be the new one would be at this layer, and so it would be asymmetric with other types that are in the hierarchy. And
I see.
Now I understand why it's the less preferred option.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I
are there
have
others?
A question. The silly question that I have is, does this change the behavior of? Let's say that right now I have a JSON type, a JSON serializable type that has a property of some enum, and then that enum gets a new value in some future version, but I haven't recompiled my own class. With the proposal here, does the behavior change in terms of the forward or back compilability promise regarding whether AOT is involved or
not? It should be invariant with respect to that. So basically,
So it's still using runtime reflection for the strings, but the thing it needs to do is tell the linker the enum type is itself important, and let it see the call into get string so it knows to preserve all the fields. Okay. Yeah, so
you were able to take my word salad and make something useful of it. Excellent.
Yep. It's a skill. It's luck. So metadata services, you now have enum converter of T and string enum converter of T. Are there any other AOT factory things that should be added in this same wave? Okay.
That is the only public converter that system.json exposes at the moment.
Okay.
And remind me, enum converter basically gives you the literal numbers, and string enum converter gives you the name of the field, right?
Yeah. Arguably, string should have been the default, but we default to the numeric representation instead. But for most web applications that I know of, string is probably preferable, which is why I think it's a high impact thing for native AOT.
Which is weird considering all the other places they want to reduce the number of bytes they send.
So how is this being used? I basically have to add this converter to my JSON options then?
So the idea is that you should be able to use the same annotations as you would be using regular core CLR. And now the source generator would recognize the annotations and replace them. And rather than doing the native AOT unsafe, untyped create converter method call, it would instead generate code that would directly produce something out of that new static method that we're adding.
I see. So the user never calls this. It will be the generator calls this static.
Correct. And for what it's worth, the JSON metadata services class is marked editor browsable.never, so users can still call it, but it's hardly discoverable.
Makes sense.
Ship it.
Thank you.
It's like happiness. All right. Eric, that's also yours.
Yeah. So this one came out of a number of cloud native related asks. Essentially, in preview 2, I believe, we added a bunch of features to system.componentModel.data annotations, and one of the things that we didn't ship was a dedicated time span range attribute. I won't go into the details as to why we didn't do that, but one thing that was observed is that the current mechanism that the range attribute uses to define ranges for arbitrary types is kind of difficult to use. And let me just share the actual constructor. So the range attribute has 3 constructors, one for integers, one for doubles, and then there's another one that accepts a system.type value, and then it accepts 2 strings that contain the minimum and maximum value marshaled as strings. And the idea is that the constructor will then deserialize these and make it possible to use for arbitrary types. And the reason for that is, of course, attribute annotations don't support arbitrary values. So the idea was, I'm guessing at the time, that I'm just going to express my time span as a string representation. I'm going to pass a system.type, and I'll let the constructor do the unmarshalling and make sure that everything works, including culture-related concerns, etc. So this is another issue with that particular constructor, and let me just share that. Oh, it's in the proposal. So the other issue with that final constructor is that it's marked as requires and reference code, which again makes it a bit problematic in the context of trimming scenario. So here I'm actually proposing that we add a 4th constructor that just accepts a I-comparable minimum and an I-comparable maximum. The idea being there that users can compose over this constructor by defining their own bespoke validation attributes that specify ranges for any types that they care about.
It's proposed as public, but you can't actually use that directly, can you?
Pardon?
That new constructor is proposed as public, but you can't actually use that constructor directly in an attribute, can you?
I had originally put it as protected. I'm not sure why I changed to public. Maybe I did that, but I can't recall. You can actually do that. Given the current shape that it's at, you could actually pass string minimum and string maximum, and it would work. Or you could pass in a string minimum and an int maximum, because it's not.
No, it won't. We actually tried this during the last API review, and we actually got compiler errors when we tried creating that constructor on the attribute, because it said that I-comparable is not a valid type to put into a public attribute constructor.
Well,
so this would require
it's not
a
literal, right? It's not, because attributes only support like a fixed number of types, because they have to be encoded as effectively literals or constants in the metadata. So I-comparable doesn't have that. Yeah.
Yeah, so the issue wasn't using the attribute. The issue is that the attribute itself wouldn't even compile.
Oh, really?
Like we literally couldn't even declare the type or create the type.
Could that be with an earlier version of the language? Because I did try out a prototype and it seemed to be working without issue. So I was able to.
I may have been using an older version of the compiler. The other problem with just having IComparable is, let's say that I pass in, 10 and 20.5 as two parameters. With the existing overloads, those would both be coerced to double. With IComparable, one would stay as 10 and one would stay as 20.5. What happens when you try to compare them? Because integers and doubles, I don't believe, can be directly compared. I believe you'd actually get errors at runtime.
Okay, so I guess in that case, I'll say this should have been protected in this proposal. The idea being that users should be able to easily derive from range attribute for their own arbitrary types in a way that they can actually have constructor parameters that do work with attribute annotations.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me.
I think you said it, but I missed it. What does range attribute provide in that case? What is the benefit of deriving from range attribute in that case?
So the canonical use case is a time span range attribute where you want to validate. So you have a POCO that has a time span field, for example, and you want to say that I only want to accept time spans that are between 1 day and 2 days.
Yep. But why wouldn't I just derive my time span attribute from attribute? Why, or validation attribute? Why derive from range attribute?
You could obviously do that. You can still do that with the existing constructor, but I guess it's you're saving yourself quite a few lines of code as well as bespoke logic.
I'm asking, what is the logic that you're saving by deriving from validation attribute instead of deriving from range attribute? By deriving from range attribute instead of validation attribute. We had this new constructor. What is the logic that is being avoided that I would have otherwise had to write if I derived from validation attribute?
It's basically just two range checks, effectively.
Yeah,
but there's
so
other
data
things
annotations. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The range attribute is doing a bunch of other things as well, which I would need to look up at this point.
Yeah, so data annotations has a whole bunch of logic within its own base attribute types. There's logic for localizing error messages. There's logic for actually doing the check, which is what Eric was just talking about. You would have to duplicate that logic inside of your own custom validation attribute, which you could do, but it is busy work.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, is specifying whether you want inclusive ranges, exclusive ranges, and of course, combinations of these things. So, of course, it's doable. The abstraction does permit that. The current constructor that accepts system.type permits that, but it's kind of awkward to use. I think that's we're not unblocking previously unavailable scenario here. We're just making things a little bit easier for users.
So then is the expected usage I derive from range attribute, call it like my type range attribute, and then I have a constructor that takes effectively the types I care about? But like,
yeah, there should be a sample if you scroll a bit further down in the API usage section. That's basically it. You have your constructor accept parameters that work in attribute annotations, and you make the necessary conversions if you want, of course, but that should validate time spans for you.
So the issue with the original constructor, the type string is that it's marked as required on reference code, correct?
And if you scroll up, I have the exact same attribute implemented with the existing constructor, so you can compare and contrast. The main thing for me is the fact that you need to convert this to a string and back, and immediately you have all these sorts of problems related to localization, etc.
Sure, but I guess I was wondering if you had called out that one of the original problems was that it wasn't AOT friendly, could we just fix that? Like, could we just introduce like a new annotation that says, oh, by the way, like this type itself has some type converter attribute associated with it that you need to keep around because that's how I convert back and forth between string and the actual type instance?
I don't have an answer for that because it's been a while since I last checked the code, but maybe, I'm not sure. Obviously, that's not the primary motivation, but it's nice that then the proposed thing doesn't actually need any of that.
Right, which makes it, as long as you're willing to do a subclass, makes it rather convenient.
Yeah.
As for the compile failure, I just tried it in SharpLab right now with the compiler from the branch called default. And while you get a compile error on attempting to use the comparable or comparable, as you see fit, constructor, simply declaring it is not an error. But the fact that it can't be, the fact that you can't use it in attribute syntax suggests that maybe we should call it protected.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. You can make a protected constructor public in the future, I believe, without incurring a breaking change.
Is it conceivable that future versions of the language could support this?
But you would run into the same, that would actually be a breaking change if we were to do that, because the example that I gave earlier, where you pass in range 10, 20 decimal 5, what would actually happen? It would start calling the third overload instead of the second. And then at that point, do things break at runtime?
I think the question was slightly different. I think the question is, could the language support arbitrary types and attributes? And the answer is no, because the language would have no way to serialize them, right?
Well, the language can already support passing primitives as object parameters. That works just fine today.
Yeah, but that's because metadata still remembers which type it was, and it's a finite set. It's basically all the primitives plus a box primitive, an array.
These would be box primitives.
And that's it. But you can't pass an comparable, right? That's
right.
No,
the only reference types are string and object.
Yeah.
Well, but it would just know.
Just be an object.
But it would just know object, and that will be what's encoded. So who's supposed to be responsible for the overload resolution if there are multiple reference types when it comes back later? Who's responsible for the cast error, which should have been a compile error?
So in range attribute, the min and max values are exposed as object properties. So it's up to the caller or data annotations or whoever to say, let me cast the min value object to comparable, pray this cast succeeds, and then call compare to whatever value is being passed in.
No. That would be if we declared the proposed overload instead of using comparable. If it was using object, it would work completely fine. The question of could the language support arbitrary type or arbitrary values in attributes, it's right now the IL doesn't support encoding them, and the only thing it could encode it as object. And now when loading the assembly and instantiating the attribute, the runtime would have to do overload resolution, which it never does, to figure out which thing these objects were supposed to go to if the signature said comparable instead of object.
No, that's not actually what happens. When you look at metadata, what's actually recorded is the token of the constructor you called, plus the sequence of parameters. So, but you're still correct. Something would have to inject the cast, right? Because the runtime doesn't do the cast, right? So so the conversion would still have to happen somewhere, and the conversion is not just the runtime that would have to be fixed. It's also any metadata reader that cracks attributes would have to do that too, right? So, I mean, in principle, I guess you could, but that would be one of those breaking changes in metadata that we pretty much never do.
But what I'm arguing is it's already a source breaking change to do that. So it's already something that's going to break applications if we were to expose that, regardless of runtime, regardless of metadata.
But that's only in this particular case of the shape of the attribute, right?
It's because we would be providing a better matching overload to something that's already there, and that better matching overload might break your application.
Sure.
So would that be an issue for anybody deriving from the range attribute as well?
Presumably, if you derive, you fix your inputs to a very specific type, so that shouldn't be an issue.
If they called base with
but in theory, you're introducing a new constructor that potentially is ambiguous with existing constructors. So in theory, an existing working range attribute derivatives might fail.
I mean that's true, but I think the idea is that the caller is responsible for doing the upcast here. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a new constraint. That's a new constraint. Right. So.
Correct.
I mean, in this case, it just works, right? Because time spent doesn't match the existing ones. If you would just pass in, an int and a float, well then, I don't know what it does. Levi seems to say it will prefer the comparable one, which is odd to me, but I guess I can see that.
But anyway, my point is, if it's gonna break if you make it public, it would also break if you make it protected, potentially break.
If they
Yes.
had heterogeneous types.
I
that were
think
getting
there's a
coerced in the call.
I think there's a difference in users, right? So I consider the people that extend the attribute as infrastructure providers versus the people that just apply the attribute are just users. So I think I'm okay with saying the people that build the infrastructure have to do potentially more work to make it happen, right?
That's fine.
Yeah, because the biggest confusion would come from Levi's example of literals, where one of them is an integer literal and the other one is a double literal. The compiler will turn both of them into double to make the cast call. So if you did have an attribute that took in int and double, and it's counting on the implicit cast when calling base, then yeah, that one might now target the iComparable. But
I don't think it does. I think if you pass in an int and a double, the second one is the best match still. Because one of the arguments has an implicit conversion, the other one is identity conversion. That's always going to be better.
Yeah, the numbery things tend to be special. Yeah.
I think if you do int and float, I think it might be ambiguous because you would always require an implicit conversion somewhere.
No, you're correct. It prefers double in that case.
Yeah. But it doesn't really matter. Like, I mean, the people that build it, they're presumably at some point they will test it, right? And then it works or it doesn't, and then they do whatever it takes to fix it, right? So I think the only question I had is, have we considered range attribute of t?
Yes. My feeling was that this provides an easier way for users to build a range attribute of t. It's actually pretty trivial to do that. I didn't include it in the proposal because
it doesn't solve the problem.
So, I mean, it provides an alternative that, yeah, it doesn't solve the fundamental underlying problem, which is that in most cases the value that you're trying to validate cannot be specified in an annotation anyway. So
yeah, something somewhere has to do the conversion to the actual user-defined type. Yeah.
Yeah. So just offering something that is general purpose enough should unblock most user applications and eliminate a lot of boilerplate that there currently is.
So then,
another thing that I put in the issue is that I also considered the possibility of adding an iCompare parameter, but I ended up rejecting that because it's basically range attribute is built around iComparable, so I kind of figured that this is good enough for most use cases. I'm not sure if people agree with that.
I mean, the only case where you normally need it is strings, but this doesn't strike me as something where you want to use a string.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Conceivably, if there's demand, we could add an overload later.
Right. Famous.
So why doesn't making this generic improve the situation?
Because fundamentally, so what the user has to do is, right, so the way attributes work is you can only have the primitive types in there, right? So you can never have a user-defined type in a constructor. So somebody always has to derive and has to say, okay, I take a primitive like an int and I turn it into, let's say, a time span, right? And that code has to be written by someone, right?
Right, but if I want to write my time span attribute, if I derive from range attribute of t, then I'm required that all the values that I'm passing to the base class be consistent. There's there's a minimum and a maximum that are iComparables of t, and the value that's being compared is a t. Whereas right now it's all whatever you want.
I mean, that's true. I mean, the people that build infrastructure have the benefit that it forces both types to be the same, but
it is unfortunate, but at the end of the day, it would just force yet another intermediate type that people would still need to derive from to get anything meaningful. We're asking users to live with a bit of with lack of type safety in this case, and make sure that they pass two arguments of the same type.
Yeah, I think we would have to do both. We would have to give the protected constructor, which is what range of t would call into, right? And then also the range of t thing. So
you could do it as a private protected constructor, and then only range of t would expose it, and now it's forcing the two to always be aligned.
Sure, but like it's still effectively public API, right?
Yeah, I mean, like it's if we wanted to introduce the range attribute of t with the notion that while creating a time span range attribute, that they still have to create the custom attribute type and extend, that it can say if you want to stick in strong types instead of stringly typed things, then extend the of t, and we made that work for you.
So we can actually do this. So you can define a generic attribute where the generic is constrained to be I number of t, and then it still accepts the primitive types, but the code inside the constructor can use the static abstracts and interfaces for I comparable, etc. I just tested this in SharpLab.
But the scenario is to use time span and other types, though, right?
Yeah, I don't know how that solves that.
Right, but you can say you can have a range of t where t is I comparable, right? And then you can have time span milliseconds, which inherits from range attribute of int, and therefore takes in the 2 min and max, and then constructs itself from that.
Well, but based on the thing that's here, I think it's expecting this to align to a property whose time or whose type is time span, and it wants to just call minimum dot compare to current value and maximum compare to. So it's not understanding that when it gets the time span property that it's supposed to extract the milliseconds from it. So it doesn't want the milliseconds, it wants the time span.
Yeah.
In other words, it should be a range attribute of time span at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Why can't you just have the min and max as milliseconds, and then have the time span range attribute expose the time spans as properties and return those as from milliseconds, range min, range max?
I mean, you can, but now you just change how you wire it, right? The base, I mean, either you can call the constructor the base type to pass in min and max, or you can expose properties and have the base class, I
mean, you have to pass milliseconds in no matter what. It's just a question of exposing the properties as
well. But the properties come from the existing validator knows how to read range attribute and knows that it has a minimum and a maximum and that it can use those. If you're saying the new one wouldn't extend range attribute, then that means you're wiring in a whole new system into data annotations.
Right.
What if we made minimum and maximum like protected set?
Yeah, I'm skeptical that this changes a lot of the code that you're writing. Like, to me, that seems, what we have right now here seems very compact. And it seems no matter what we do, we need to have an extended type where the indirection happens, right? So I don't know what else you would do.
Another thing that I'll say is that in my prototyping, I found that this actually introduces minimal amount of changes to the existing class, as in it only adds this constructor. So this shape kind of slots in nicely with kind of the essence of how range attribute has been implemented. So I tried many other kind of a bit more elaborate approaches with type safety in mind, but kind of the simplicity of this one kind of won over everything else.
What about making it so you just have range attribute of t where t is I comparable, and then you just have range attribute t minimum, t maximum, and then time span milliseconds inherits from range attribute of time span. That way you still get the type safety and minimize the code.
I think adding one constructor beats adding more types to the library.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And that's because range attributes already shipped.
Yeah. For a while now.
Yeah, but there is a usability concern, in my opinion, that the reason we have generics is so that enforce type safety, and this is an untype safe interface as it is.
And one that might not work well with reflection or other scenarios.
Why wouldn't it?
Well, you're going to have to go through the trimmer or native AOT or whatever is going to have to go through a lot of work to determine the concrete types in all cases when you're boxing to an I comparable and potentially passing it through along various levels.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, generally speaking, the data annotations library isn't particularly friendly to native AOT stuff in any case. So,
well, there's a code generator to deal with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would normally agree that like we shouldn't add new types unnecessarily. But if we have a solution that allows one new type that's generic, that covers all the needs. We've done that in several places in the past as an expansion. Just because it is one type that suits everything at that point.
yeah, I think generally speaking, the problem that I have with generic attributes, well, I'll put it differently. Generic attributes that accept that generic parameter as a value parameter, they don't make for good attributes in general because of the known restrictions in what values you can pass. So I don't know.
Well, in this case, you would never expose as a generic attribute, right? The generic is just in the hierarchy somewhere, right? Like
Right.
And actually, the hierarchy I think would be flipped. Range attribute of T would be the base, and the existing range attribute would derive from that and just be where the T is a whatever the
Would that be a
integer.
breaking change?
Or it supports
that-
two different values. Oh, that wouldn't work. Yeah.
That would require replumbing all of the data annotations.
Yeah, no, sorry. If range attribute only supported one type, either int or double, then you could have done that. But the fact that it supports both, you can't make it support. Yeah, never mind.
I don't know. So I put basically I put that in SharpLab and just sent a link.
I mean, that works. I mean, I don't think it adds much, but I also don't care. If people feel strongly, we can ship this too.
Well, it does simplify. So I think the main thing it buys is it massively simplifies and helps make the correctness of the range attribute a bit easier for the I comparable case. And it makes it much clearer for users what's expected when they are implementing it, and doesn't restrict it to they don't have to be boxing and unboxing and incurring allocations whenever they're trying to do all of this, trying to read all the attributes. So it just helps various things and makes it slightly better than what we have today.
I mean, it will get boxed. Range attribute doesn't. A range attribute exposes minimum and maximum as object. So
Right, but the range attribute of T can
Is
can expose a new property of min and max of type T. That way you can avoid the box.
That's not the typical optimization that needs to take place. On validation attributes, the isValid method takes an object, like it's going to get boxed regardless, the value that you're comparing against.
Yeah, that's a general like data annotations framework thing, right?
Yeah, like unless you change validation attribute itself, you can't avoid it.
Yeah, I would generally
Anyway.
assume we just plumb it through the existing thing, right? So that's why I left this guy here, just made it private protected so it disappears basically. And then the expectation is this guy just calls into that, right?
Is I comparable of T a subtype of I comparable?
Actually, no, I think we need to constrain it to I comparable. You're right. They're not related. Unlike I enumerable.
So there are a few things that you need to consider here. So data annotations has since time immemorial only allowed minimum and maximum to be int, double, and string. So if callers are expecting it to be if callers are expecting it to be only one of those three things, just be aware of that. The other thing is data annotations has range attribute has some pretty gnarly logic inside of it to set up all of the conversions itself. We somehow need to figure out how to get that logic not to kick in. when this overload's called?
So I'll say that this conversion logic actually only kicks in for that third constructor that accepts system.type. That particular implementation, at least in my prototype, kind of has a trivial piece of conversion logic that doesn't have all the gnarliness that you're mentioning. So it's basically exposing sort of the guts, as it were, of range attribute, because fundamentally all this logic, all it does is reduce user inputs to 2i comparables. And the core logic is just validating that the value sits between the two.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So what is the operand type going to be reported as here?
In my prototype, I believe it's checking that both things have the same runtime type.
And then reporting their runtime type?
Correct. So if they don't have, so any sort of polymorphic scenario are, I guess you could try to infer if the two values are in some sort of a subtype relationship, but I think that might be making things too complicated. I'm not sure.
Why don't we make the constructor take in the actual T? I mean, it's private protected. It doesn't really matter what it is, right? It's internal at that point.
Right.
But like range attribute of T, the type becomes T.
Sure.
Can you go from a T to a type of T without sort of any sort of linker annotation? Does it always work?
Yeah, should do.
So we can always get a type out of a T. Okay. I mean, it seems like you kind of want that because I think it's otherwise fragile, right? If you assume it's always a value type, sure, that probably works. But other than that, I don't know, let's say you have a person, right? And then one happens to be the instance of a professor, the other one happens to be the instance of a student. I don't know, probably a bad example because you don't compare those, but you know what I mean?
Professor could be a student in a different department.
Yeah, but you don't really have a comparison between students, right? It's like, what do you base it off of, right? I don't know. Their grades. Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, the existing notion of the implementation, it just casts everything to I comparable. So really the question is, would anyone ever be reading minimum and maximum that isn't the framework itself? To be surprised that new data types can be present.
I mean, you could ignore it entirely. I mean, I guess the only reason we care about the type is for error reporting, right? Don't we say something like these ints cannot be compared or something? Like, who cares about the type? Like, when are we caring about this? Is it just because we enforce that they're the same type?
I mean, the range attribute has a property of type system.type called operand type. So this will now gain new values, and the minimum and maximum object or properties that are of type object can now gain types that they weren't previously. So there are runtime inspection behavioral changes. But the question is, does anybody actually care, or are they just using the framework where it once is valid?
I mean, there is the third constructor that does accept arbitrary system.type parameters, subject to certain constraints, but it's not the case that this attribute as shipped could only work with ints or doubles. Like it always has been the case that it could handle other things as well. Not everything, of course.
Well, but the minimum and maximum were going to be strings in that case. So the minimum and maximum properties only had 3 values.
So basically what happens is that the attribute performs a lazy conversion from the string values to the I comparables using the operand type. So the reason why the operand type is significant is it's being used to drive the unmarshalling from the string parameters to the actual instances of the given type.
You basically use the type to locate the type converter, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Oh, it sets it to the string and then it calls initialize, which overwrites them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me there's really no downside of saying this internal method here takes comparable, min, maximum, and then the type, right? And then you just marshal the type at full fidelity, and you don't care which order they're
Right,
in.
And that lets it be whatever the range attribute of T said. That's what the T is. So it gives you control over the type.
Yeah.
Oh, right. I remember this silly thing. It's one of those things where the value of min and max change based on whether isValid has been called before you query it.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yes, because we can't do it within the constructor because constructors shouldn't have any logic which might fail.
At least that used to be the guidance. I gather that we no longer enforce this.
Yeah, when this was all created back in what 3.5 or whatever, that was a guidance. I remember now because I way back when, like, I used to be one of the co-owners of this, and it was a weird system.
Well, I mean, because of metadata readers, etc., attributes should have no logic, and the whole isValid being on this hierarchy was a design mistake, but it is what it is.
Right.
These attribute types should not do work. They should just convey data.
I'm still not convinced that we need the generic attribute, though.
I'm not convinced either, but I also don't want to talk about it anymore. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just it has more moving pieces that I normally would find useful, but I don't feel strong enough to say absolutely not. I guess this is an example here at the bottom, right? It's not the actual approved API. I'm not going to ship this.
I like it because it basically means we don't need to add any sort of runtime logic to say these two things don't make any sense to be compared.
Yeah.
You would probably want, if you did a range of T attribute, you would probably also want an abstract method, which is, I have an object that was passed to isValid. How on earth do I convert it to a T?
So
say again. What do you want a conversion for?
So isValid takes an object. How do you turn that object into a T?
Doesn't matter. It's comparable, not a comparable of T. The type itself said it can handle taking an arbitrary object and answering the question of is it comparable.
I'll say that given that we are now entertaining the possibility of introducing a whole new type, should we design it the right way and have T be constrained to a comparable of T? And maybe even not have it derived from the base range attribute and have it be its own thing?
I mean, you could. I don't know how much plumbing there is. I mean, range attribute of T is pretty large. So you would have to probably copy some decent amount of code or do some creative hierarchy hacking.
Well,
yep.
Because that's what I thought originally, but then looking at the code here, it is all based on the system just instantiates the attribute and calls this valid. So as long as it extends validation attribute and defines an is valid, that's the only plumbing it should need into the system, right?
Well, I meant more like whatever code we currently have that does the, the comparison, whether it's in the range, and then I don't know how many cases it handles and provides specialized error messages, right? That code is not duplicated in two places, right? But I don't know how much that is. That might just be 10 lines of code, right?
Right. You need the minimum and maximum, and then the booleans for where the minimum and maximum inclusive or exclusive, and then the like 8-way switch it needs on that for what do I do with the return value of compare to.
So what I'm hearing here is Eric probably should take a look offline to figure out whether we can have a range of T that is unrelated to range attribute. And then we can take an I comparable of T rather than an I comparable.
Yeah, I was inclined to come with the lazy design, but I think if we are occupying the namespace with a range attribute of T, I think further due diligence is needed. I'm not necessarily convinced that we should be doing that. I still think that the original proposal is good enough, but if folks think that that's the right way, fine by me.
Yeah, I would. If we did that, I would want it to just subclass validation attribute directly, not even go through range attribute.
Yeah, given that this was done wrong and that attributes do the work, it's actually easy to add a new one. which
But like I said, this proposal wouldn't be in contradiction with a future range attribute of T either. So I think this is a quick and dirty way to unlock people, and we could entertain a possible range attribute of T in the future, should there be such demand.
All right, so then.
So yeah, we should probably, okay, if you want to punt range attribute of T to later, it probably should structure that if you wanted to take the 2i comparable, should still take the type of what should it report as the operand type.
Sure.
Instead of doing guessing. And then if we want to say garbage in, garbage out, then
So what would take the op type?
sure. What you have now is the private protected constructor just becomes protected.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of type string string, it can take type I comparable, I comparable.
Yeah. I'm guessing that won't have any overload implications on the third constructor that's not in the list. The one that takes type string string.
If you're calling it with strings, then it would hit the exact match and that would win. And if you're calling it with I comparable types that had a user defined conversion to string, then it'll change. Yes. Don't do that.
I mean,
that should be okay.
So, but I think I lost so why would we make it protected rather than private protected? Like, who cares calling this method?
Well, if we add range attribute of T, and that's the answer,
right?
Then we leave it private protected. But I think Eric is suggesting that should be unrelated. He wants to go back just to adding the one constructor, at which point we get rid of private and it just becomes protected.
Yeah, I mean, my assumption would be if we do what we have right now, where range attribute is extending range attribute, I think we would do a private protected constructor, right? If range attribute of T would be unrelated to range attribute, I don't think we need the constructor at all, right? Why would we even have it?
I would prefer for it to be separate, because I would prefer for it to do kind of like the right thing with air quotes around there.
Right, but then the question is, are we saying don't extend range attribute non-generic at all and wait for a real range attribute of T proposal, or
that's kind
do
of
what Eric asked and add the...
So that's kind of my position here. So like I said, we should consider design where range attribute of T doesn't extend range attribute such that we can constrain T to I comparable of T, right? And so I'm inclined to mark it as needs work and just flip it back to Eric. And then he can either look into it and decide how many moving pieces this solution has, or we just go back to the original, or we do what we have right now, right? I mean, these are the three options I see.
I think the generic attribute is the right way to go. So
I agree.
If we're going for do the right thing instead of the easy thing, I think it's what you just said, Emo. Needs work.
All right.
Make the T that is a validation attribute.
Okay. Oh, Jesus, what's happening? Oh, I did already. Again. All right. Back to you, Eric.
All right.
All right. Who can represent this one here from networking? Tomasz probably, right? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so sorry, I was out last 2 weeks, so didn't attend. And I know I look at a video, so there were, I guess, some questions and concerns about how this stuff is used, and I don't know really where to start. So basically, when we add this type, the certificate context, it was meant for SSL stream, and since Quick lives in separate assembly, it cannot access it. So in 7.0, we basically made it public, but we didn't put it to the ref assembly, so it's kind of hidden. And Steven commented on that, and there's this old issue mania open a long time ago that we basically dodged the problem, and I think now we are trying to sort of clean it up and make it sort of first-class citizen API. I don't necessarily feel there'll be too many users besides runtime. So there was a question about the in parameters and whatnot. I think Jeremy commented on that last time. So basically, you can give it extra certificates. We built X500 chain under the cover. We figure out what the chain should look like, and we set it in internal array. And then basically for every single collection, whether it's Quick or TLS, the SSL or the crypto code needs to access this and basically set the certificates in the outbound TLS hello. So we just need some access to it. The original proposal was to read-only span. I think Tanner commented and asked about the memory. So some people on the team felt that memory might be more flexible than span. Read-only span of X500 certificate would be just fine. We don't really need memory if that helps. We just need access to it and basically make it immutable so people cannot mess with it. If possible. The caveat, though, is that since it gives you access to the certificate, somebody can still dispose the certificates and create a mess. We don't create a deficient copy because that'd be expensive. So somebody can still mess it up if they try hard. And the last piece of information, the certificate context is not currently disposable, so nobody can really dispose the thing as it is right now, which is somewhat unfortunate. We start bolting more and more functions to it, and one day maybe we bite the bullet and we would make it disposable. But for now, really the goal is to expose the set of certificates which are in particular order. So both SSL and Quick can basically set them on the connections.
So how does this work today? So like, I mean, you're basically just exposing data that the constructors are parsing, right? But who today is on the hook for disposing those?
Not quite. So basically, as Jeremy said last time, you can add, so you don't have to provide additional intermediates. We would try to fetch them, or they might be already in your certificate stores. So that's fully optional. We will just construct a chain which leads the root as best as we can.
Right.
And the TLS specification says you should send the intermediates during the handshake. So this represents the set we choose based on our processing, what is going to be sent on a wire.
Yeah, I think I get that. What I'm saying, like I'm just talking about the dispose stuff, right? So you're effectively just exposing that currently, right? Because I mean, that already happens today. It's just that nobody can see those, right?
Correct.
So that, and so now that they can be observed, I mean, even in today's world where you don't expose them, who's on the hook for disposing those certificates? Like,
at this moment, it just runs from finalizer.
So basically you just say to GC, eventually it will be collected and that's fine, right?
Yeah. And again, I wish somewhat we have a dispose or disposable only context, but we don't at the moment. So that's our sort of best option.
Yeah.
Get at it. Dispose in the context shouldn't dispose the target certificate because you don't know if the caller still has a reference to it. The intermediate certificates would be clones, but the target certificate, in order to know about the private key, it's still going to be the strong reference that the caller passed in.
So you're saying basically this is shared, so it wouldn't dispose this, but it would dispose this?
Yeah.
I mean, the design makes sense to me. I just think it's super odd to use read-only memory as a glorified collection, because we don't usually do that. We usually use read-only memory as a buffer, so read-only memory of either chars or bytes, but not really of some random custom type.
If you do span, we fine. We can do read-only collection, that'd be fine as well.
Yeah. So the guideline we have for span, because I know it came up before, is avoid returning span or read-only span unless the lifetime of the return span is very clear. And if we say that really this is a non-pooled managed array and it lives forever, you know, as long as there's a GC reference to it, then that's clear. So I would be reluctantly okay with read-only span. I don't like it. I'd be okay.
So why do you think read-only span is better than read-only memory?
The only thing somebody can do with read-only memory is call .span.
You can store it, like you can capture it in Lambda.
I mean, it's just that logically the class can't hold to it as a span, right? So logically the class has to hold on to some heap allocated thing, right? And by basically saying you give people only a span, that means if somebody wants to use it in an async context, they can't anymore, right?
Well, I mean, they can just capture the stream certificate context instead.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, or take intermediate certificates to array.
Right.
But yes, by
Sure.
Going with the property should return the strongest thing they can. Read-only memory is more flexible than the span. So
it's not actually.
Well, because it can be saved in a thing that's not a ref struct.
Correct.
That's why it's more flexible.
Well, no, sorry. It's read-only span allows a wider variety of implementations in read-only memory, is what I was getting at.
Yeah, that's true. But
yeah.
but basically what I'm saying is that it can't, like, fundamentally the type can't have a field that is of type span, right? So because
no,
it's a class.
however, if so, one of the optimizations that we do, or at least have played around with in a few types, is to have a backing field that is a single item or a collection of items, and we will project a read-only span around just that field if needed, without taking the hit of the intermediate allocation of the collection.
I see what you're saying.
And read-only memory does not make that easy, because read-only memory requires you to make a memory manager for that, whereas read-only span literally just works.
Right.
Right. And read-only memory, it's slower. If you want to do anything with it, you reasonably have to get the span anyways. And it's really only useful for if you're returning something where you're not going to be preserving the original item. Like if you're creating an array and you don't want to expose the array.
This really just needs to be IEnumerable, right? Yeah.
When you actually have an object like the certificate context, then I think returning that and having that have the asspan method is just more efficient and simpler. In the rare case you do need to capture.
Yeah, but all that you really need to do, because you're passing this to Quick, and sorry for talking over you, Tanner. You paused and my brain kicked in. I think you were breathing. All that you really need is IEnumerable, unless you also need to count, in which case you can expose a separate count.
We don't need count. We basically iterate through the list, and we basically, and again, it should be ordered. So we could simply just go through IEnumerable list and say, hey, this is it, and we literally just for each certificate get the OS handle, and we set it for OpenSSL or Quick, and that's about it. We, in theory, would not even need the whole certificate. We could use the handles, but obviously we don't necessarily expose it too much, or we don't use it too much publicly. So
yeah, I mean, there's also just value in this being public. Of somebody can look at what they got out, and it's hey, why did you not send an intermediate? Well,
and people
at the end of the build here, it wasn't in the type. So.
Yeah, if the build doesn't work or whatnot, there's currently not good visibility. So being able to actually walk through certificate lists and dump them to logs or whatnot be useful for troubleshooting and diagnostic.
Yeah, but the property being an iterator state machine over the array, instead of just returning the array as an IEnumerable, still is good. Like, that's better than any of these other things. Because read-only memory, you could try get the array and you could overwrite it. Read-only span, technically you can turn that back into a writable span and then write to it. But if you give it back as just an iterator state machine, nobody can ever write back.
Yeah. Basically, the context is created typically once per application start, right? So Orchestral would start, create a certificate context, and use it over and over and over again. And the goal is make this as cheap and safe as possible for accessing, because that's done on every single connection.
So did I hear this right? You said the instance of the context lives once per application?
Well, typically would, right? So you start your server, so you load your certificate, the target, you create its context, and you use it over and over. again for every accepting collection.
Yeah, in that case, why don't we just make it read-only collection? Like, I mean, at that point, allocations don't matter, right? It's a one-time hit you take, right? Like, right? I mean, if this is a per request thing, I would get it, right? But if it's not a per request thing, then by all means, just use a regular collection here, right?
If memory serves, the old pattern of using SSL stream, where you pass the certificate, where basically it sees the certificate uniquely per connection and builds the chain per connection, wraps through this. So there is, in the old expensive way would become epsilon more expensive. But yes, in general, it would be amortized to 0.
You can make it immutable collection, that'd be fine as well, right? We just don't want anybody to fiddle with it because we cannot implement it. Never actually asks about people want to set random certificates in random order or a specific one, and we just cannot implement it on Windows. So whatever is here needs to be immutable as much as possible.
Don't we expose some, even if they're marked as unsafe or dangerous, some mutating members on X509 certificate 2 itself?
You could always dispose of it, but yeah.
So there's an import method. It doesn't do anything on core. It will replace the contents of the certificate on framework.
Isn't there like a raw data thing that if you could write to the byte array or something?
It's a defensive copy.
What, didn't we add one without it? Am I misremembering? I thought we added one without a defensive copy.
We added a raw data memory property, which is one defensive copy.
And it's read-only memory, yeah. But I think Jeremy's right. The only mutation that you can do on core to assert is literally just to kill it.
Yep.
Which you could always do because we can't stop you from calling dispose.
And that would be fine. We would probably just throw object disposed exception when somebody tried to use the context later, so it could be handled reasonably well.
Yeah, I'm not arguing against this based on that. I'm suggesting that there are already things that you can do to muck with these things, so we don't have, and it's all within a security boundary. It's all within the same process. Like, we don't have to be overly concerned about someone shooting themselves in the foot. We can take reasonable strides to do so, but
yeah, actually, certainly,
yeah, it's. I guess the question is, would somebody be tempted to mutate the array to reorder it to insert things, stuff like that? And the product team, the area owners are best suited to answer that question, honestly.
I didn't hear. What was the downside with read-only collection? Does it makes use of it more expensive?
I think the problem with read-only collection normally is that it just wraps another collection, right? So you basically have the perfit of having effectively 2 containers, right? 2 allocations to represent the collection. But if this happens once a freaking lifetime of an app, like, I don't care.
That read-only collection of X509 certificate 2 sounds good to me, as long as Moss is willing to take his object allocation. I mean, you just did a chain build. Like,
I mean, we could do that. Yeah. We could do a mutable array. I'm fine with read-only memory personally.
Yeah, like you're dealing with crypto here. Like there's expense under the covers, like that's going to completely eclipse any one-time allocation you might have.
I'm glad we talked about this for 20 minutes. All right, so all right, so then that was easy.
Very nice. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Have a good evening. All right, so composite format features.
So Martin opened this for 3 things. One, he was concerned that the error messages we throw from composite format.parse lack any details, and we fixed that. It's also not an API thing. The second was requesting a try parse overload that outed the error message. And we can come back to that, but I don't see the use. I don't see the need personally. The third is exposing the number of arguments that are required for the formatting to be successful. And that's a very reasonable thing to expose. We already have the number in the implementation. It just needs to be exposed. So this is, if you have a format string with a whole, brace 0, close brace, brace 1, close brace, that requires 2 arguments. Or if you had just open brace 34, close brace, that requires 35 arguments. Basically, it's whatever the largest number in any of the holes is, plus 1. And it's the minimum number of arguments you need to supply. You can supply more than that, and the rest will just be ignored. But if you supply less, it'll blow up because it won't have the argument to fill in one of the holes.
So the value of this came up in some kind of generic code that's accepting a format string from through config, and then just formats the data at runtime based on that template. So we just want to validate that, yeah, this has the right number of arguments for what we're going to be supplying to it. As for the try parse case, the idea is I think the interface that's there now is either broken or useless. So you pick. So format strings are complicated. We have some cases where format strings are megabytes in size, and just saying invalid is when parsing is not useful for the customer. So
the part as I mentioned, the parse now throws an exception.
Yeah. Let me finish.
Yeah,
so the exception throwing case was improved. So now there's meaningful errors, which is great. Then either the try parse needs to also surface these errors, or try parse should be removed. Because providing a try parse that doesn't return errors is inviting a bad pattern of just telling the user, sorry, failed.
I'd much rather just remove try parse than add another overload for it. I think it's already suspect. Composite format is meant to do all the heavy lifting. You're not supposed to do it per format. You're supposed to do it once and then cache it and be done. And so if you're not using it on fast paths, then that's what try parse, the try pattern is really meant for. So if it came down to, do we want to add one more, or do we want to remove it? I would remove it. That said, I don't have a problem keeping it if we thought there was a use. I mean, we have plenty of places where we have tries that don't surface what went wrong.
Yeah, it's just that parsing an integer is a much less involved thing than parsing a potentially very large, right? So the idea of writing a complicated parser, say like a compiler, and having its errors reported strictly through throwing exceptions seems, on the face of it, to me, is incorrect. Right? It's not an exception that a parser encounters errors. It's part of parsing. So I think that pattern that exists in .NET from the beginning was always wrong. But it's tolerable because the inputs tend to be trivial. So parsing an integer, parsing a float, that kind of stuff. When you're parsing a real complicated, potentially very large amount of state, you expect to get a list of errors out of the thing, and not just exceptions.
I mean, I guess that depends on what the typical user experience is, right? So like, I mean, for a compiler, it's part of the user experience that you report precisely what went wrong where, so the user can fix it, right? If this is most of the time you expect things to work and you just basically don't want to pay the price for exceptions in case it doesn't, then I guess try parse works, right? But if your goal is to basically have an API where you can report back what the user has to fix, yeah, then you have to do something differently, right? But I feel like, I guess it depends on who is the consumer here, right? I mean, if parse is, I mean, I don't know, like, I mean, these are generally speaking, like, who's basically the consumer here? Like, what are you doing with the like, who's calling try parse and parse basically?
Well, so yeah, so specifically, I think if you're calling parse, you're just going to have your format string built into your code, right? And you call parse at the beginning, and that's what you do. Try parse would be typically called for inputs that aren't under your control, and then, by the way, the initial call to parse has no try around it. It's just you assume it's going to work, just like when you do a regex as a static in your code, you just assume it's going to work.
Right.
Whereas try parse is used when you don't know where the input comes, and that's where the error is important.
And you get an exception. I mean, if this was something where you were going to be parsing these at high velocity, then yeah, I get it. But if you're parsing these at high velocity, you're using it wrong.
Probably also true.
So, at the end, it's 6 lines of one way or 2 lines the other way, so it doesn't matter that much. But
so I guess I'm kind of at a loss. Like, how is this parsing related to the proposal here? Like, you still like, is this related or no?
If you scroll down, Martin's original proposal was proposing 2 methods, and I removed one of them.
Ah, okay.
Oh.
Yeah, if we haven't shipped try parse and we don't have a good story for it, then we can easily remove it and add it later when we have a story for it. But the answer in .NET is we throw exceptions instead of returning errors. And anytime that you feel that we need to deviate from that, it needs a very, very, very strong case. And we've never had a try parse out what went wrong. So that would be messing with an existing pattern. And I think that we would want a new structured parser pattern if what we want is structured parsing. And
I mean, in a sense, that's true, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily great, right? So a good example here is, complex documents like, let's say, XML or JSON. You could make a case that the existing method in the framework is problematic, right? Because the exception only returns the first error, and then it's like usually not very helpful, right? So if you want to do something like an IDE that actually renders documents, people basically have to write their own XML parser from scratch just so that they can actually have error recovery that is somewhat sane and actually render squiggles in more than one place, right? And that's, you could imagine, like you say, like, well, the cost of parsing an XML document is so high. Well, you might as well have some sort of, collection of errors, right? Or diagnostics, which is basically what Roslyn gives you, right? Roslyn gives you a compilation. You can ask the compilation for, well, what are all the errors that you have, right? And so I think for things that are sizable in size, like documents, I think it makes sense. For super tiny things like strings and integers, I think an exception is fine, right? Because there's usually not more than one error, right? It's like, you fucked up something very, very like basic, probably, right? And that might be true for these format strings as well, right? It's probably
if we wanted the XML primitives to be usable for after an error, have an assumed state and keep going to give more squiggles, because the problem is once you hit the first error, you don't actually know what state you're in.
Right.
You're just guessing at that point, and that's what all the color syntax highlighters do after the first squiggle.
Yeah, of course.
Unless they can hit something that proves them in a known state. But we would design the API to do that. We wouldn't have a try parse that is like, oh, here's some, like, we'd come up with what's the flow and what you're supposed to do, and we'd design it as a real thing instead of just like, oh, we have a thing that's close to it, let's just kick it and bolt a thing on the side.
Yeah, but I think there's a case of making perfection to be the enemy of the good here. The overwhelming majority of cases is you forgot an open brace at offset 25 in your format string. You go add that and you're in business.
So I do want to call out that, like, putting default policy into a general purpose framework has bitten us time and time and time and time again.
What is policy here?
Policy is exactly what Jeremy said. Like, this is not a well-structured XML document. What should I assume my state is when I see an error?
No, I think they're different things, right? I think it's well defined if you have an error, right? Like, error-free or basically well-formed or not well-formed is a well-defined property of XML, right? The question is, if it's not well-defined, can I get the list of errors, right? And yeah, probably the first is correct, and then from there on it depends, right? If the parser completely choked on you, but I mean, that's kind of the problem of all compilers, right? I think for the framework, I think practically speaking, what you care about is like at some point you have a code path that says I need a valid XML document, and you're okay with throwing if it's not, right? But then when you get to the exception, it might have a property called errors, and then you can for each over them and say what are all the errors that you had, right? Or maybe there's a built-in thing where you don't even have to wait for the exception. You can just say get errors on the document, and then it gives you all of them, right? I mean, there's multiple ways you can do that. I think the question is, how much do we care? And I think in this case here, I feel like an exception that just tells you what Martin just said, put a freaking brace at offset 14, right? That seems fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it currently says put a freaking brace at offset 14.
Yeah, I think
yes,
that's
I may have left out the word freaking. Yeah.
No, I would put it in. Like I would use a different word that starts with F, but that's okay.
All right, I think we should just kill try parse and add num arguments needed, or whatever name we want to call it.
So the conclusion is we remove try parse, but we don't add the other one here?
Yeah. We maintain number of members.
So is given that the semantics for the property, should it be min arguments needed?
So I had proposed, sorry, if you scroll up a little bit, it could be min. I had proposed, what did I propose?
Required argument count.
Required. Yeah, it could be
minimum required arguments needed.
Yeah, or whatever. We pick some name.
I mean,
minimum argument count.
Yeah, sure.
Ask ChatGPT. Defer all style decisions to AI.
So,
yes, and Steve did use a different word that starts with F. It was failure.
Ah, excellent.
So I guess I lost it. So like, how am I using the minimum?
So we have code that consumes a format string that's specified by the user in config. And then we later format it at runtime. And if we don't have the right number of arguments relative to what the format string has, we crash. So now instead we can say, hey, user, you specified 2 format arguments. We're only expecting 1.
Gotcha. Fail early, basically, right?
Yeah.
So it's not that the format string is incorrect. It's just incorrect for the domain expectation for the user. Yeah.
Exactly. And at format time rather than at parse time.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense to me. So what did we say then? Minimum argument count? Is that what we said, or?
Yeah, any variation of there sounds fine to me. It's if you supply a smaller number, it's going to throw. If you supply that or higher, it's going to be fine.
But they're kind of ignored, right? Isn't that not?
If you supply more, they'll be ignored. Yeah.
Yeah. It's possible some of them themselves will be ignored. It just knows.
Yeah. If
this is
minimum argument count is 5, they might all be all but 1 might be ignored.
Yeah.
But yeah. Like if the string was just open brace 5, close brace, the minimum argument count is 6, but only one of them is going to be used, the last one.
Min arg count. Sounds good to me.
Yeah, we normally don't abbreviate, but yeah, actually, arg seems borderline acceptable because we have used arg before. Everybody happy?
I am ecstatic.
Is that it for the Reds?
Believe so, I think, yeah.
That is.
So yeah, I skipped a few ones that are like sizable, so I just picked one that seemed reasonably sized.
This will hopefully be quick. Basically, for more UI-focused things, if you put STA thread on your entry point, the runtime recognizes it and sets the apartment state of your thread to STA. So you put that on your main method, it's recognized. If you put it on your async main method, that's not actually your entry point. The compiler synthesizes the actual entry point main method that then calls your async method. And STA thread on that async main is then a no-op. And even if it weren't a no-op, putting it on your main method is probably not what you wanted to do on your async main is probably not what you want to do anyway, because once you await something, you're going to end up on, you know, some other thread that's not STA. So the proposal is just an analyzer that says, what are you doing? This isn't the attribute you're looking for.
I see. So, okay, that makes sense now.
Am I remembering correctly that when this issue was first surfaced, there was a discussion with the Roslyn team on whether or not attributes put on async main should propagate up to regular main, and we decided not to do that, right?
Yeah, it was discussed and dismissed.
Okay.
I don't remember if it was exactly associated with this issue, but there was definitely this discussion you're talking about. It was definitely dismissed. I just don't remember the timing.
Yeah, it was like a couple years back now. It was way before this issue. I just remembered something around that having been discussed at the time.
What does the generated main actually do? Is it literally what's on screen right now? It just calls main async.getAwaiter.getResult?
Yep. Just invokes the async main and blocks. So it's basically just, you know, allowing you to use the await syntax inside your main method, and then ensuring that your main thread doesn't go away until that async main task completes.
And you said something that I found confusing. Like, isn't the default setup when you don't say get awaiter false, don't you basically get back to the same thread you came from when you await?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
So like when you normally do an await and you don't do the, dot, what is it? Configure false or whatever. Yeah. Or configure await false. Don't you always end up on the same thread that started the awaiting?
There's some confusion. It's hard for me to answer yes or no to that question, so I'll explain. So by default, without configure await false, when you await a task, the awaiter grabs whatever the current synchronization context is.
Right.
And any continuation is then queued back to that synchronization context. That's the whole story.
Right.
So whether you end up back on the same thread is entirely dependent on
the sync context, yeah.
The sync context. Now, Windows Forms, WPF, they all basically publish a synchronization context, usually lazily, when it's like when you do control dot
invoke,
or when your event handler basically is invoked in Windows Forms, it ensures that there is a synchronization context published on the current thread that will target the message pump for that thread.
Right.
That's not going to happen until later, though. So when you're just sitting in main, like there's nothing set up, there's no message loop running. There's if you await at that point, like you're going to end up on a threadful thread.
Yeah, that was the thing I didn't have, because I was thinking if you get back to what is effectively the UI thread, then that seems to work, right? But if you're saying there's no way you get back that, then yeah, that doesn't work.
Yeah. Now, if you were to call some method prior to awaiting that set, it's called synchronization context dot set synchronization or set current, I think it is.
Yeah.
Then any awaits after would see that current one that published it, but there's nothing like that by default in main.
I think I kind of buy the argument that if you do UI development and you require STA, having an async main is probably not what you want. You probably want to do something different.
Yeah. So I think the analyzer makes sense. I don't think it's a huge priority, but we've seen multiple people hit it, so that's why it was opened. There's a question of, do we want a fixer, or do we just want to warn and tell people like there are various things you can do? A fixer could do multiple things. It could, well, I guess he has it on the screen right now, what it can do.
And number 3 would be delete the attribute.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it is in make it not async, right? Because it sounds like if you need the attribute, then you need the attribute, but why are you writing async main?
Right.
But it sounds like, Steve, if I understood what you said correctly, it sounds like there's not necessarily a singular "this is what you should do" answer. It's more like analyze your scenario and then follow like one of these 2 or 3 recommendations.
Right. You're basically doing something nonsensical, but we're not entirely sure what you intended to do. So
Yeah.
here's our documentation page, and choose what you think makes the most sense.
And what
At
would we,
that point, then, oh, sorry, go ahead.
so what would we trigger on? Just basically the attribute applied to an async main, or also the, if anywhere in the method you would have current thread dot set apartment state.
No. I wouldn't do that automatically. So it would literally just be if your async main method has an STA thread attribute on it, warn.
Yeah, I wouldn't have a fixer at that point. I would just redirect them to a doc page and say exactly what you said. Like, we couldn't figure out what you were trying to do.
Would you also do it for MTA thread? Just because it's you put an attribute here and it doesn't mean anything?
Sure. Although, I mean, I don't even know if we recognize MTA thread in the runtime, do we? Since effectively everything is multi-threaded anyway.
I just remember that we have the MTA thread attribute.
I honestly couldn't even have told you we had that.
We could say it doesn't do anything, so we don't care. And when you put it on async main, it does the exact same nothing, and so we don't care. But
I mean, I would assume it will do some com initialization, does it not? When you call set apartment state?
It might call co-initialize.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know. I've never seen anyone use it.
Yeah, me neither. I mean, who does com? I mean, probably in com enterprise services where you had a com-based backend thingy, maybe, but like, I think those times have passed.
The short answer, I think, to your question is, Jeremy, is I have no idea, but I don't think we want to even have it enter the conversation because it doesn't matter.
For reference, MS Build's Xmake and their out-of-process task host both are decorated with MTA thread.
Okay. But if you read the comments, they explicitly say, "We know this does nothing. We just wanted to distinguish it from a piece of code that used to be marked STA thread."
Awesome.
Fair enough. Good ambiguity. We explicitly use MTA. Doesn't actually do any work unless com interop occurs for some reason.
Yeah.
So the runtime might still be doing something about set apartment state MTA might have an effect that is different than the uninitialized state.
Maybe. I mean, we could always, send a message to the other Jeremy offline.
So the only reason why maybe the set apartment state method is interesting, if you have the, what is it called, the modern version of program.cs where you don't have a main method anymore, you just have effectively a bunch of top level statements. At that point, where do you put the attribute, right?
Are top level statements main or async main?
Well, it depends whether you await or not. If you don't await, then they're regular. If you do await, then they're effectively an async main. The compiler automatically does that.
But you would use option 1 here if you needed to call set apartment state.
Yeah, because you would call it and it would set it on a thread.
Yeah.
Just the question is it the thread that you wanted to be on?
Well, I would assume if you do what I said, like the top level version of WinForms, the first thing you would do is basically call this method because that's the closest you can get to the attribute, right? Because presumably when the runtime invokes your method, it already set that for you, right?
And that'll be the same.
Yeah.
The calling thread current thread set apartment state before the first yield would be the same as if it was done in the calling method.
Right.
But once you've hit the first yield, now you're in La La Land.
Yeah, that's probably a different bug you have, right?
Right. So that would be potentially a different analyzer of looking for calls to set apartment state in main async or top level main that are after a yield.
But I mean, you could simplify it and say, if you are either in top level territory, you have any awaits, and you call set apartment state anywhere, it doesn't matter where, we just flag and say, this looks fishy, because you probably don't want to do that. For the same reason that if you have a regular main method with the attribute and an async main, that's easily broken, right? So it's kind of the same brokenness, right? We don't need to look at when you call set apartment state relative to the awaits, because we just know that it's always fishy, right?
Well, but if we do a fixer for STA thread or put in docs, the way to fix it is keep your async main, but add thread current thread set apartment state as literally your first line of code. We don't want two analyzers fighting each other.
So my understanding is, based on what Steven said, is that that's not the right fix either. You should just not have it. That's what I heard. Like basically, if you have awaits and you use STA thread, you're probably not doing the right thing. Did I misremember that, Steven?
No, I think that's probably right. I mean, you would need to make sure that when you're setting STA because you're going to be running some kind of message pump, and you would need to make sure that you invoked that message pump on that thread. And so basically, you would need to be running the message pump before any awaits were incurred. At which point, if that message pump isn't going to end until the end of your program, you're never going to hit your awaits. So like, why have them in the first place?
Yeah. So then, is it then fair to say the analyzer will trigger if an async main has the STA thread attribute, or if you have top level statements and you call set apartment state and you have an await somewhere in there? Because it's kind of the same problem.
Yeah. I think we should vet it with Jeremy and other WinForms folks, but I think that's reasonable.
Do you need Jeremy and Jeremy because it's also touching com?
I mean, let's just make it the trifecta. You can join too.
I've already given it a big shrug, so.
So I put links in chat. The runtime only ever uses that in one place, and it does not differentiate between the existence or non-existence of MTA. The one and only thing it ever looks for is STA thread.
So MTA is just a
like it will look
exactly the way
for
that
MTA, but it won't
using it.
Yeah, it'll look for MTA, but it won't do anything with it.
Sounds like an opportunity to save a few cycles.
Sorry, what's looking at MTA?
The loader. Yeah, I put some links in chat.
For apparently no reason, because then it doesn't use it.
No.
So what it does is it checks to see if you've put both STA and MTA on the same entry point, and if so, it fails to load the application.
Oh, I see.
And then aside from that check, the only thing it's actually looking for is STA.
So Emo, if we're gonna warn if you put STA thread on async main, and we're gonna warn if you called set apartment state in a top level statement that also has a yield, which is going to turn it into an async main. Are we also checking you called set apartment state in async main?
Yeah, maybe we should just simplify the logic to it's either an async main or it's top level statements with await, and you either have the attribute applied or you call the method, right? In which case we don't care which combinations it is.
I guess really we could say calling set apartment state in an async method is just like, we don't care if it's async main. You called set apartment state in an async method, you're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Based on Steve's, you don't seem to be actually an async method if you're doing this.
I'm sure someone somewhere has come up with some construction that makes sense, but
yeah, they can suppress the warning.
Yeah, it would definitely be a rarity.
So set apartment state in an async method, or you put STA thread on async main.
Yeah, so then kind of like that, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying, I don't know that we would check that the async method is main or that it's an async top level statements. We'd just be like, am I in an async method? And you call set apartment state warning.
Sure. I mean, it doesn't really make sense, I guess, to have STA thread or anything but main, but sure.
Well, I mean the call to set apartment state.
Yeah, it's same argument, right? Calling set apartment state or applying the attribute or anything but main seems fishy, but okay.
Well, I mean, applying STA thread attribute to anything other than main is being ignored as possibly a different analyzer of why are you painting this method, because it's not going to change the at least I assume it's not going to change the apartment state just because you've entered the method. That it only has meaning on main. Levi, you were looking at the code that handled it. It's only on main, right?
It's at the application entry point, if one exists, which I assume is main.
Okay, so then,
yeah,
like this.
Ship it.
And then
Yeah, like I don't know how you get the entry point.
how do you get the entry point? What do you mean?
Like I don't know if there's a specific way from an analyzer to figure out what the assembly's entry point is.
There is. You can ask the compilation.
Okay. Because I guess it could be something other than main. I don't know.
I don't think so, but like you don't have to search for it. Like the compiler will find it, right? If there is one.
Okay.
You get the I symbol that represents the entry point.
Because I know that there's the thing that you can, if you have multiple candidates for the entry point, there's a compiler flag /ms build property for I meant this one. I don't know if the compiler will accept a thing that is not of the right shape as the main method and named main.
I don't think it has to be.
That means that IL probably says it's that one and doesn't have any real rules.
Yeah, because ultimately the thing that you want to detect is like the user thinks this method is the entry point and that's where they've annotated it. However, the compiler thinks this other method, perhaps an auto-generated method, is the entry point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can certainly compare those.
Yeah.
But that might be different analyzer, right? Like if you apply the attribute to anything that is not the entry point, right?
Well, yeah, that's basically what this is saying. Like you've applied it to something that's not the entry point. Like what have you done? No one's looking for it.
I think so. First of all, category is correct, and warning is also correct, right?
Warning is correct.
Reliability sounds right.
Is it? Because what we're really telling you is this did nothing.
Well,
yeah. So I remember we did something similar for principal permission way back when. Like I guess for that we actually made it security, not reliability.
Yeah.
But it was still an error saying like you probably wrote this because you expected it to have a side effect, but it does not have a side effect. So like think long and hard about what you've done.
What's
category usage is the catch-all, right? It's
yeah.
Like what everything is.
Well, because usage makes sense to me for the attribute version. And maybe also for the direct call to set apartment state. What would, if you call set apartment state but don't do anything apartmenty?
Well, I mean, it's still
anything useful? I mean, does it do anything?
So if you do, if you don't call STA thread, right? If you try to do something like accessing the clipboard or anything else that requires the infrastructure for STA thread, it won't work. So like you have to call those methods to get it to work, right? But if this thing doesn't do anything, well, your code won't work, right? So like you have effectively a reliability issue for your code.
Right. So I guess really this is what happens if you call STA thread and don't use any of WinUI. Nothing. Like it just never mattered.
Yeah, I mean, if you use STA thread and you don't call into anything that requires the COM threading model for STA, then yeah, nothing will happen probably.
Okay.
But yeah, I've built console apps where I had to apply the attribute just to access the clipboard, right? Like that's the kind of shit you have to do.
Yeah, I've done the same.
Fair. So that's just me asking on the category, because one of them is this attribute was ignored, and the other one is you've changed the apartment state, but not necessarily on the thread that you think that you're on, or not necessarily on the thread that you meant to, and you've now changed something about the process. So I don't know if that's where reliability comes into.
I'd say
so. Yeah, reliability is fine.
Yeah. I don't think we have threading as a category, right?
So just to confirm, like are we doing this on any async method, or are we looking for async main, or what?
No, we don't look for main. I think the conclusion was we look just whatever method it is in, and there might be different analyzer to say like you apply the attribute for something that is not main. That's probably not what you intended.
Because I don't think that's clear from the text that's on the screen right now, what exactly we're looking for.
An async method has the attribute, or an async method calls set apartment state. That's any async method.
Any async method, not just async main.
Yeah.
Okay. Because what
I cared about was the any async method for set apartment state. If we want to have the original thing where it's talking about the attribute, if we want to say that's a different STA thread was placed on a thing that is not the entry point, and then it gets to explain async main is not actually the entry point of an application, then
yeah, because that seems to be
Sure.
a more universal rule that would just kind of encompass this failure as part of it running, right? Like it wasn't on the entry point. Like it literally had no effect. You wrote throwaway code. You wrote throwaway code that you almost certainly intended to have a side effect.
Well, it depends how you write it, right? If you go to if you ignore the attribute, if you just look at set apartment state, I mean, you can totally do that in the entry point, right?
Yeah. And again, going back to weird usages, you could have you source included something else that has a main method, and when it's actually being used as the entry point, it should be STA thread, and you've said this other main is my entry point, and I don't care about, I'm not going to do the com thing that the other guy was going to do. It's, you can suppress it in that case. It's super degenerate, but it's not necessarily the case that it's wrong.
All right.
It's just probably wrong.
We good then, or do you want to change it, Levi?
It just seems like we're talking about a theoretical second analyzer coming up in the future that's going to have significant overlap with us. That's the only thing that makes me uncomfortable.
I think that's probably fair. I mean, we can probably have just a single diagnostic that says your combination of entry point and apartment threading doesn't seem sound, right? Which would encompass all of those things, right?
Yeah. So maybe it's, and maybe they're two different diagnostic codes. One is you called set apartment state that an async method, and the other is that STA thread is not on the entry point.
Yeah, I think that's probably a distinguisher that I would prefer. Because one is like you're calling a method that actually has a side effect, but you probably did it incorrectly. And the other one is you wrote code which is going to get deleted, and you probably did not intend that. Or not deleted, but just like straight up ignored.
Like this then?
Is it true that set apartment state should only be called from the entry point?
That would be a good question for, the other Jeremy.
Yeah.
Because the two statements I was making is STA thread. The method that has STA thread is not marked as an entry point. That's one diagnostic. The other is calling set apartment state from an async method. On the basis that has been determined to be nonsense.
I mean, that's a good question, right? What happens when you apply STA thread to a random method that you then use for thread.start? Does that do anything?
Not that I could see within the runtime code.
So we literally only honor it on the entry point?
So it's assembly entry point, not thread entry point?
I'm double checking that.
Okay.
Okay, I can clarify this and say, assuming that's wrong. Assuming that is actually wrong.
Yes, this is literally execute the main method of the assembly. There's nothing about like random threads coming up here.
All right, I have a hard stop now. I have to move. So how about we leave it like this, and then if there's more feedback, you can comment on the issue. Sounds good?
So I'm gonna have one piece of comment in that set apartment state is meant to be called from other threads when you're creating the thread in particular. So we don't want to warn on any case of calling when it's not the entry point.
Right. So
Right.
attribute not on the entry point, period. Set apartment state called from an async method, period. 2 bullets. They're sort of independent, right?
Well, current thread, set apartment state called from any thread should be an error, because that's always going to fail. It's if you create a thread, even from an async method, and you call set apartment state before you've called start, that is the only case where it's safe.
Right.
Sure.
It's specifically a method for before the thread has been started.
Okay. This sounds like it's a lot more complicated than we just said. Maybe you can
Right,
doodle the
which
notes
is-
in the thing and we can talk about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
I think
kind
we've-
of why I like
think
this
we've
being two
approved
different issues.
The analyzer's intent and somebody else can work out the details.
I think that's true. All right, guys. See you.
Auf Wiedersehen.